My name is Sadie Urban. I'm the events coordinator here at the Reserve. This talk tonight is part of a year-long lecture series funded in part by the Kickapoo Reforestation Fund and also by the Friends of the KVR. Tonight we have Evan Larson. He's a geography professor at UW-Platteville, and he's here to talk about and he's here to talk about invasive earthworms. So if you could sign this as it goes around, I do need to keep track of attendance for grant purposes. So Evan, thank you.
Thanks, Sadie. The reason that I'm here tonight is to talk about earthworms. And the work that I'm going to be showing you is research that I've been part of for a number of years now, starting at the University of Minnesota while I was working on my PhD, but most of it since arriving at the University of Wisconsin in Platteville. And specifically, this work has been focused around engaging undergraduate students in hands-on research to give them that really high impact experience as part of their education. Not just teaching them about geography and earthworms and things like that, but teaching them how to do research, how to ask important questions, and how to critically analyze what they find. And so these are just, this is just one group of students that helped with a certain part of this project, but all of the research that I'm showing you has been supported by student efforts with funding from the Wisconsin Alliance for Minority Participation, College of Menominee Nation, the Sustainable Development Institute. There have been a lot of people involved in this, and we're really excited at how it's progressing. So, let's step back. The world's a big place, right? It's huge. I love this image. It's beautiful. It's the blue marble series from NASA. And when you think about the world and how it operates, sometimes there are creatures or organisms that maybe are very small, but have a tremendous impact on how the world works. Okay? Beavers are a great example, right? This is a rodent that changes the landscape. It goes from a river to a lake when they dam a water body, and that has fundamentally different properties. The whole ecosystem can turn over. It changes. Okay? So they change their environment. I would argue there's also another really good example of ecosystem engineers. People, right? Here's a Google image satellite image of the Great Plains. It's not quite what it used to look like. Or, oh, they're down in Virginia, or maybe, making lakes out of rivers. So here again, I would say people are also very, very strong ecosystem engineers. We change the way the world works. Today, we're going to talk about ecosystem engineers of a different sort. And I would guess you can guess what those are. Specifically, we're going to focus in on the Great Lakes region. And so I love this image. You see this dryness gradient from the rain shadow of the Rocky Mountains. You get eastern, and it gets greener and greener. And right up around those Great Lakes, it's that rich forest, right? And we have our prairies and we have our oak savannas, but we also have these hardwood forests. This is a nice example from down by Platteville. You've got your overstory sugar maple and oak basswood. And as you go down through that canopy, you have multiple layers, seedlings, saplings. Every now and then a tree falls over and new trees come up, right? It's a very dynamic system. This is very characteristic. If you bring your gaze down to the forest floor, they tend to be extremely diverse. The trilliums that come out in the spring, the bloodroot, and then that whole seasonal succession of plants, a very, very rich understory. This is an intact northern hardwoods forest. If you look at the soil, typically has this really thick layer of organic material. It's called the O-horizon. It's last year's leaves on the top, and then the year before that, and the year before that, and it goes down through that humus where you pick it up and you smell it, and it smells so good. And then you typically have a very thin A-horizon that is basically the transition from that O-horizon down to the mineral soil. This is a very characteristic soil series for a hardwood forest in the Great Lakes region. The story that I'm going to tell you today starts up by Leech Lake, which is in northern Minnesota. You knew that, didn't you? Okay. And it starts with a DNR ranger who had a favorite stand, a really big old sugar maple. He walked through it all the time. And this is a photo of part of that stand, very rich, some big overstory trees, whole mixed age structure, a really gorgeous place. He became concerned when he was walking through on the same path that he's taken for a long time, and he realized that there was a line in that forest where you go from this to this. Dramatic start. These photos were taken in the same stand on the same day, same light, about 100 yards apart. And that's one thing, to see such a sharp transition. Those are rare in nature, but they occur. The problem here is that this was moving. And he saw it progressing through the forest every year, moving further and further. And then it got to a road, and it jumped the road and kept going. Ooh. It's terrifying, right? It gives me goosebumps. Some unknown thing affecting the forest. There's nothing you could see. And a lot of people got concerned, a lot of people got involved, and they had more and more forests that looked like this, with this overstory of hardwood forest, but you can see an impoverished forest floor. It's dirt instead of that humus layer. And they didn't know what was causing it at first. They called it forest decline syndrome because they did not have a mechanism. There was nothing they could blame. Researchers kind of across the eastern United States started to become involved, including a group at the University of Minnesota, which is my way into this whole story. And they started looking at this and started coming up with potential ideas. Cindy Hale was a graduate student back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and she was one that brought me into this. And she had set out a series of plots across one of these invasion fronts, going, here's the altered forest, there's the intact forest, and she had surveyed a whole bunch of factors, looked at soil and nutrients and light and all sorts of things. And the one consistent relationship that she kept finding over and over and over was that in the altered forest you had a lot of these, here you had none. Already gave that one away, right? Lumbricus terrestris. They're night crawlers. Altered forest you had worms, the intact forest you didn't. It's amazing to hear her stories when she tried to publish this, because of course everybody knows earthworms are good. Everybody knows earthworms have been here forever. To say that they're actually invasive and they're completely turning over this ecosystem had a lot of people like, whoa. No, you can't be right. It's such a little thing.
What year? I'm sorry, what year was that?
Her first paper came out in 2004.
Oh.
So it's pretty recent in terms of science, right? And it's an interesting thing because if you look at where most of the impacts are happening, they're up here in northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, some in upstate New York. And they basically kept finding more and more worms, and they sent them off because there are people that make a living identifying worm species. And every worm that they sent was European. So then the question is, well, why aren't there native earthworms? Does anybody have a guess?
Glaciers.
Ooh, let's go back 18,000 years, right? Ice, mile thick in places. As an earthworm, it's tough to make a living underneath a mile of ice, right? And so even in places like the driftless, almost all of the driftless was in permafrost at the peak of the glaciation. There was no suitable habitat for earthworms for basically all of the northern North America. You go forward, all of a sudden you have European settlers coming in. We're really good at moving things around, right? There's ballast in ships, soil, fodder for livestock. We love shrubs, right? Lilacs are from Europe. You can track earthworm invasions from where people have planted lilacs because they were in the root balls and then they spread out, they emanate, right? Unless you're in a totally invaded site. They're great in agricultural settings. We have lots of people that encourage them. They aerate the soil. It's better for our crops. It mixes our compost in, right? So not only were we unintentionally introducing earthworms, we're intentionally introducing them to improve our lands, right? Fishing bait. Fishing bait. So, I mean, we now have night crawlers at my parents' place in Minnesota, and I remember trying years to get night crawlers established there so that we could pick our bait, right? Like, oh no, what do we do? The site on Leech Lake. Once we finally figured it out, you look at the very center of this invasion front, literally emanating out through the forest, is a fishing resort. We went and talked to him and said, oh yeah, I've been trying to get night crawlers established for years. So he could pick them and sell them to his guests, right? Nobody knows. Well, people are increasingly know, but nobody knew that these little buggers are really doing some tremendous things. Ironically, Canada is the world leading exporter of earthworms, though they have no native worms themselves, right? So we're really good at moving these things around. They're really good in our compost bins and in our agricultural settings. But when they get out into those forests, and if you think about it, glaciers 18,000 years ago, those forests have been developing for thousands and thousands of years without native earthworms. This is a Google search for fishing resorts, right? And you know they're not all listed. So these are the ways that earthworms have gotten around. There's been a lot of work looking at how they affect the forest ecosystems out there. They increase how much nitrogen goes out of the soils into water. So even if we manage nitrogen applications on our fields, earthworms are amplifying. They actually result in a depletion of calcium, magnesium, potassium, phosphorus in hardwood forest soils. They increase soil density, they reduce native plant species richness and abundance.
Increase soil density.
Yeah, it turns out their poop is more dense than an unimpacted forest soil. They loosen agricultural soils. So the fields that we plow or that are grazed on, those get compacted by the pressure. Earthworms loosen those, but you put them into a forest and they actually compact the soil. Ovenbirds and other ground nesting songbirds that need shelter. Once the earthworms move through, you have decreased nesting success. Facilitate invasive species like buckthorn and honeysuckle by opening up that soil. And there might be some synergy there, and maybe this is not the case, but there's a lot of evidence that says they do facilitate. They actually increase greenhouse gas emissions from soils because of the way they enhance respiration in the soil. I mean, so these worms have this immense range of impacts, and it's huge. And we could talk for the whole night just about those, but we're not gonna, because that's not what I do. I use trees. And so my question, and the reason I was brought into this is, okay, they're doing all these things to the soil and the plant communities, but what is the impact on trees? How do they respond? So what we did is we went up to Leech Lake. There's another site in the Chequamegon National Forest near Drummond. I'm going to show you data from. And then we also worked right here on the Menominee Forest. And we went out and we looked at what's happening to the trees themselves. At Leech Lake, we went back to those permanent plots that Cindy had put in. The earthworm invasion, what we now know, is moving at about 2 to 5 meters a year, kind of creeping along, unless a bird picks one up or a fisherman picks one up, or however they get a boost. But you have the invasion front moving along, and so what we did is we cored trees here, and we cored trees here, and we cored trees here. And then we looked at the growth patterns of those trees relative to when earthworms arrived. This graph is showing you kind of the growth patterns of these trees across those 3 different sampling sites. So this is kind of the far right site where we cord trees, and then this is right the midpoint, and this is the far left. And so these are correlations, and so what this is basically saying is that before there were earthworms at this site, all of the trees were doing pretty much the same thing. If one tree was putting on a wide ring, they all put on a wide ring. If one tree put on a narrow ring, they all put on a narrow ring. It was a coherent system. After earthworms arrived, the 2 sites that still have no earthworms are doing exactly the same thing. But when you compare trees growing in earthworm-invaded conditions to earthworm-free conditions, all of a sudden that signal breaks up. They're not doing the same thing anymore. And that's really interesting, because there's a lot of reasons that we want to know how trees are growing, whether it's from forest management, forest productivity, things like that. The mechanism behind this was really interesting. So this is a little bit like a flashback maybe from an acid-induced experience. But what this is actually telling you is the relationship of how wide or narrow a tree ring is relative to how much moisture is available. Okay? These red colors mean that those are periods where the trees were really sensitive to drought. And you know that 1930s drought that showed up in the Driftless Oaks chronology? Well, that hit the whole region. And so you can see in the 1930s and up through the 40s, these trees were all very sensitive to drought. And then it got wetter in the 50s and 60s, and you can see that relationship dampens. Okay? This is before earthworms arrived at this site. I'm going to fade those out a little bit. Okay? Okay, same. Whoa, hey, look at that. All this red appearing. What ended up happening is when earthworms arrived at this site, you have these big sugar maple trees that are in this fairly rich, wet site. But after the earthworms invaded, the trees actually became increasingly sensitive to drought. Interesting, right? So that was an interesting finding. I'm going to explain what that actually represents here in a moment. So we looked at another place. We looked at the Menominee Forest. I love this image because you can actually see the outline of the oldest sustainably managed forest in the country relative to the fragmented landscape. And we went there because they had old maple trees that would hopefully have quite a bit of growth prior to the arrival of earthworms. And I mean, for example, here's one of their maple trees. Let's go up and up and up and up. They're huge, beautiful maples, 250, 300 years old. The conversation of getting sampling permission was really fascinating because they totally didn't buy it at first. And it got to the point where I was sitting with Marshall P. Corr and a handful of others that are in charge of Menominee Tribal Enterprises. And he said, well, we used to pick worms all the time when we were kids to go fishing down at the river. And I said, yeah, but Marshall, like, you have stories for every creature in this forest. Do you have any earthworm stories? And he said, huh. And one of the guys, Bo, got out and he called his grandma and said, Grandma, I have any stories about earthworms? I was like, I got no stories. And so that's when they said, okay, you can do the work. So, I mean, it was really fascinating. The problem was, and this is really interesting, here's the research crew. We went out and we looked for earthworm invasion fronts, these lines of worms moving through the forest. The Menominee Forest is so closely managed. They have very light impact logging roads throughout the entire forest. What that ended up means is that we actually couldn't find any places that were totally earthworm free. Earthworms are everywhere. Different species though. So the way that you do this, you take a gallon of water and you mix in about 1/3 of a cup of mustard powder and you shake it up. Okay, so this is an earthworm extraction. This is looking for earthworms. The mustard powder, it's like the stuff you can buy at the grocery store. Don't get the organic kind. It does not work as effectively. Okay, shake it up and you pour it out on the ground. Wait 2 minutes, pour again, wait 2 minutes, pour again. That water and mustard solution, as it seeps down into the ground, irritates the earthworms. I don't know how we know that. I know that's what everybody says. It said it itches. How do you know what an earthworm itches? I don't know. Right? And then you wait. Then you wait. And all of a sudden, these little critters start poking up. And it's pretty amazing. If it just rains so they're close to the surface, I've done this with school kids where, they'll get right down and all of a sudden a big old night crawler will come literally stretching out of the hole and the whole crowd goes, because they'll just come racing out of the ground. And you sit around and if you're doing this for science, you collect them. And they start literally the ground can be writhing with earthworms. These little guys right there. I'm going to include this, so if you want the recipe, you can always come back to this. This is being filmed, it will be available online. And then we cored trees, kind of along these sites where we had sampled earthworms. On the Menominee Forest, it was a fascinating thing. We had earthworms in most places. We found one invasion line of night crawlers moving through a site near Upper Bass Lake. But the results were more mixed than what we had expected. At Bass Lake, based off of everything that we could tell, you had kind of these trees doing the same thing, and all of a sudden you see this decrease. What this graph is showing you is called basal area increment. It's a proxy for how productive these trees are. So all of a sudden you had a decline in productivity. You kind of had the same thing at Elma Lake, another site, but there were earthworms everywhere, and so it was really kind of confusing. We needed another site. So we enlisted the help of Brian Huffmeyer. He's the director of the Great Lakes Worm Watch Institute out of the Natural Reefs. It's true. He's out of the University of Minnesota Duluth, the Natural Resource Research Institute, NRRI, and he runs a program that is documenting where earthworms are. It's citizen science. So if you do this mustard thing, call up Ryan and be like, hey Ryan, I saw Evan talk about worms and I just poured mustard all over the ground. That's the ones I found. And actually, ironically, on the drive up here on public radio, they just were talking about the new jumping earthworm.
Yeah.
Right? Have you heard of these? Mm-hmm. They want people to tell the DNR where they'll find these worms. We have some on the campus at UW-Platteville, but it's a new Eurasian earthworm that when you touch it, it thrashes so wildly that it can flip around. It's kind of like a jumping bean, except it's a jumping worm. Anyway, I digress. So, if you find earthworms, call Ryan, let him know what you find. He'd love to have your data. He's also kind of working with a lot of researchers to develop a cohesive approach to understanding where are they, what are they doing, and what do we do about it. Well, we brought him in, had a good group of students. We went out to this site up in the Schwamigan. It was a more systematic approach. We found an invasion front. We ran samples across it, going from kind of earthworm invaded conditions to earthworm-free conditions. And we knew we found an earthworm-free site when we got down on our knees and pulled up the humus. What Ryan has in his hands right here is it's that O horizon. Thick leaf litter, roots, just rich, right? So we put in our little plots, 33 by 33 centimeters, and we poured our mustard solution, and then we picked through, and we looked for worms, and we looked for worms, and we looked for worms, and the mosquitoes were all thick, and it was hot. It was great. It was so much fun. The students had a blast. And we waited, and we waited, and then they came out. So, give them a bath in alcohol, so they die happy, and you ship them off to the Great Lakes Worm Watch, and they'll ID them for you. They dry them out, they incinerate them, so you can find out what's their biomass, and it's all in the name of science, it's all in good fun. And then in this case, we also took soil samples to get a picture of what's going on underneath the leaf litter. And we cored trees. And sometimes it's really hard to start a tree core. And sometimes you get lucky, and this was one of the students, Giselle, when she nailed the pith, the very center of the tree. It's always reason to celebrate. So this graph is going to show you exactly what we found at that site. So site 1, no earthworms. With that soil core, there was about a 6 centimeter layer of duff. So that O horizon. You get down to the mineral soil, you go through the A horizon, and then that's down into the E, or the parent material. Okay? The illustration here shows you moss layer at the soil surface. 100 meters on, based off of our sampling, we had no earthworms here. All of a sudden we had earthworms that are called epigeic species. And these are little earthworms, and they specifically live in the O horizon. They only eat fresh leaf litter. They only exist in the O horizon. And we found a few of them. We also found that the forest floor, that O horizon, had declined by about 4 centimeters in thickness. It was down to 2 centimeters thick, which was interesting. Another 100 meters on, the O horizon was completely eliminated. We had exposed dirt at the forest floor. The epigeic species were gone because their habitat was gone. And we found the arrival of lumbricus. That was the first couple night crawlers. The moss line was exposed here, and we actually had moss growing down the tree and exposed buttress roots on the maples. Go another 100 meters, epigeic are completely absent. We've got a huge abundance of night crawlers, and moss has grown almost down to the dirt, right? Over the course, if you look at earthworm biomass, it goes up and up and up. This is a classic invasion front. It's been documented time and time again, where you literally have a wave of earthworms invading, completely changing the forest floor environment. When we looked at growth patterns, this is all of those different 4 sites, looking at years when it's wet, and you can see that they're all basically doing the same thing. Okay, the growth patterns are the same, highly correlated. During dry years, it completely falls apart. Here again, increased drought sensitivity, just like we found in Minnesota. But this was the part that I was stunned by, and we went back and we reanalyzed the data from Minnesota and found the same thing. So these are basal area increments again, so this is productivity. That yellow line up on top, that's the earthworm-free site. The blue, you can see, is right at that midpoint, and then these are the long-term invaded sites. And if you look at the last 30 years, there's a huge difference in productivity. I'll give you an illustrated example. If you look at how much wood was produced by those maple trees over the last 30 years at Site 1, it's that much. Site 2, where they just recently invaded, was already showing declines. Sites 3 and 4, you had 70% of the productivity that you had 100%, or at Site 1. That's a 30% reduction in productivity since the arrival of earthworms. That's huge. Went back, looked at Leech Lake, same thing. Basically, the longer you have earthworms in a site, the less productive your maple trees are. Maple trees, that's important. I'm going to come back to that. The mechanisms. Decreased growth, decreased productivity. You have the physiological shock of that forest floor being removed. All of a sudden you have roots exposed. You've changed the growing environment. Fine roots that are all along these larger roots, those are critical for taking up nutrients. Those desiccate and die, right? So you have literally a change in that growth environment. Mycorrhizal communities, so the fungal communities that go all through that organic layer, all of a sudden you lose them. They have an incredibly important synergistic relationship with the canopy trees in terms of how they utilize resources, how they access nutrients. And then you have that loss of minerals and nutrients from the forest floor. Increased drought sensitivity. If you think about it, if you have a garden and you want to keep moisture in it, you mulch it. What happens if you just take all that mulch away? Think about how much that changes the growing environment. Huge. And compacted soils actually means that you get more rapid runoff when you have earthworms. I'm going to take you on a visual tour of this site to show you, because it's one thing to talk about, isn't it? Show you some cartoons and little wiggly graphs, and I can say, look at how important those graphs are. But when you walk across an earthworm invasion front, it's an awesome thing to watch people's response, because it is profound. Here we are. This is that earthworm-free site. I want you to take a look at this trunk. Nice and smooth, all the way down to the leaf litter, the moss at the leaves. Everybody got it? Okay. Another spot, earthworm-free, straight trunk. You know, pretty good coverage of herbaceous. Another spot, straight trunk, herbaceous ground cover, looks pretty good, sedge mat there. Okay? You get the picture, right? Intact forest floor. We're now right at the leading edge of invasion at the Chequamegon National Forest site. Okay? You see how all of a sudden there's some flaring around the bases of these trees? And you see how there's less green? I also want you to know, see all those baby maple trees? Those are the ones that are just waiting for a big tree to fall down and they'll go up into the canopy. Okay? Here's a little bit further on, and this was one of the most profound realizations I had. I was walking by and I was like, wow, I wonder why all the moss died around that tree. That's interesting. And I took a closer look. That's not moss, those are fine roots. Those are roots that literally were underground a couple years ago, if not that year, where the earthworms have actually eaten away the organic layer and exposed those roots within the time frame that they're still there, because then you go just a little further on, and these are the dead fine roots that have fallen off of those roots, off of the main roots. Notice that moss line? Notice the flaring of the buttresses? That's where the forest floor used to be. Think about it. This whole forest used to be 6 centimeters taller. The volume that these little buggers work. Did you know that Darwin studied earthworms? Charles Darwin? It was when he was getting sick and he didn't want to travel as far, and he paid a number of old women from the town that he was living in to go into his farm field and gather earthworm poop every morning. Those little cats, they leave these little piles. He had them gathering that, and he calculated that over the course of about 5 years, 5 to 10 years, the earthworms were moving about 90% of the top 10 centimeters of his farm field. His idea was that they're actually responsible for burying artifacts and rocks and things like that. Obviously, he never picked a rock in Minnesota because they don't bury the rocks. They come up. And he said they were really smart because he did all these tests with earthworms. We can talk all about Charles and his infatuation with earthworms. But if you think about it, that point, that the entire forest floor used to be up there, and now it's dropped down that far. Buttress roots. And this is nearing the end of the transect. You can see that the moss has actually grown down and is now reaching the new forest floor. Here's a recently exposed sapling. That's where the soil was, or the forest floor was. You can see this one's actually starting to tip over because the ground has been consumed around its roots. Exposed roots. This is a leatherwood plant that used to be growing upright, and it literally fell over when the earthworms came through, and then it started growing upright again because its support system was taken out. This is another shot trying to get at that angle. It was a fascinating thing. And here's site 5, or I should say site 4, stage 5 of the invasion front. Lots of exposed ground. See all these sticks? Those are mostly dead maple saplings. There's no regeneration. This forest is changed. Same forest, 400 meters away from that totally intact landscape. Isn't that crazy? From this to that, earthworms. Profound, isn't it? It's a little unsettling. The other thing that we thought was just crazy is that underneath this closed canopy of maple trees, late successional species, that's where a forest wants to go if you just let it be, right? You had pine trees establishing. There's not a successional model that exists in the ecological literature that says you get pine trees establishing underneath maple. It doesn't happen in a normal setting. Now, we only found a few of these, so maybe it's anecdotal, maybe it's making something big out of nothing, but the fact that they were there was pretty profound, in our opinion. Let's talk about impacts for a second. I'm going to wrap this around, because I don't like to end on like, oh, the world's going to die. 30% reduction in productivity among sugar maple. You talk to the folks on the Menominee Reservation, sugar maple is that is their cash crop. That is a vital resource. They have those huge maple trees. They made the basketball courts for the Final Four a few years back out of maple from the Menominee Forest. So if you're slowing down productivity there, that's going to hit them in the pocketbook. That's really important. I love maple trees, right? I love maple syrup. I like their colors. I like the smell of it. I like burning it. It's good wood, right? This is some research out of the U.S. Forest Service where they've looked at kind of where we have maple trees now, sugar maple specifically here. And then they applied a whole bunch of climate change models and predictions and said, okay, so if climate turns into this, or if climate turns into that, or if climate turns into that, what's going to happen to the range of these plants? Are they going to stay the same? Are they going to move? Are they going to migrate? So this is one of the projected ranges of sugar maple based off of certain climate change scenarios. So basically a huge reduction of abundance in maple. And one of the main drivers here is increased frequency of drought. But what if earthworms actually make that sensitivity to drought even more and accelerate this loss? Okay, so now all of a sudden we're talking about these little earthworms that might fundamentally change the migration of an entire species of tree. By the way, they change the forest floor. And the crazy thing is, it might even be happening already. And this is satellite data from NASA, and it's looking at canopy greenness. So how healthy is the forest? Red indicates that there's a declining trend in forest health. And if you'll notice this really heavy pocket of sugar maple, highest density in North America, that's the area with the greatest declines in greenness. And there are people inventorying earthworm impacts all over there. There's just a thesis completed at Michigan State that found that out of 120 sites where they have significant canopy dieback, every single one of them had a full earthworm invasion. It's correlation, it's not causation, but it's pretty good. It's pointing in that direction. This is huge. These are earthworms. Isn't that terrifying? Did you have any idea? Okay, but so here's the thing, because it does no good to just think the world is coming to an end. There are forests in Europe still, correct? Right. So, if there are forests in Europe, and there are European earthworms in Europe, obviously we're still going to have forests in North America. They might be different, but we'll still have forests. And so this is the direction that the research is now going. This is a guy named Fritz Schreingruber and Holger Gardner, and they run a lab in Switzerland. And they are wood anatomists. And they've pioneered work where you look at exposed tree roots, and you look at their cellular structure, and you can tell the ecological history of that site. Especially, Holger specialized in looking at landslides. If you have a landslide and a tree root that was underground is now exposed to the atmosphere, its anatomy goes from looking like a root to all of a sudden looking like a branch, which is really cool. And I mean, it's profound, right? They had a landslide here, and you can see the ring structure of this root. All of a sudden it becomes a branch. And so I was talking with them, I was showing pictures of these invasion fronts. They said, you might be able to get at that with anatomy. Here's a birch root that used to be underground, right? It's now exposed. And so with that same project, we went out, we dug up roots next to some of these trees, and we took little slices out of them. A little slice here, a couple slices there. And what we're now doing is actually analyzing the anatomy of tree roots. Because the big question is, what's the long-term impact? We can see the immediate effects. But what happens after 100 years? Have any of you been to Blue Mountain State Park toward Madison, right? If you go again, I want you to look at the understory. That is one of the most infested sites I've ever been to. You go in by like, maybe this time of year, it's just dirt. It's just dirt. It's a hardwood forest. It should have a rich understory. It's just dirt and all. There's all these little piles of earthworm bins. And we could walk outside. I was going to bring mustard, but I was running late, so I didn't pick up any. And we could find earthworms here. You can find their little casts. And it's an amazing thing. And I'm happy to walk outside afterwards.
We actually do that with school kids. We have our own mustard.
There you go. So you can do this yourself, right? But so what we're doing here now is we're taking these roots and we're slicing them extremely thinly, paper thin, and then you stain them and you scan them and you look at them. And those little black dots are basically wood cells. And if you look at the change in diameter of those cells, you can get an idea of if that root was underground or above ground. And we're still refining the technique, but in general, you can see these declining trends as you go closer and closer to the bark of these tree roots. What we're able to do now is essentially identify when earthworms arrived at a certain site. So we can hopefully go to Blue Mound, take root samples and say, okay, earthworms have been here for 120 years. What does the forest look like? Let's compare to a site that's been invaded for 60 years. Let's compare to a site that's been invaded 10 years. And what we can do is start to understand what are the long-term changes that we can expect in these forests. Because they're still going to be forests, but what are they going to be? If you can't grow sugar maple, how do you manage? What species do you favor? Right? Let's talk about something more relevant. Here we are, looking out over the Kickapoo Valley. Beautiful, right? A lot of properties have oaks that look like this. Great oaks. Must have been open grown at one point. How many of you have or know somebody who has a restored oak savanna or restoring oak savanna? Right? Okay. One of the keys for getting an oak savanna is to get fire back onto the landscape. It's a critical ecological process. You go about 30 yards from this into the interior where you have full species assemblage of earthworms. How do you ever burn that? You can't. And so there's a colleague of mine, Yari Johnson, who's the director of reclamation at Platteville. And he and I are just starting to put together a project where we're going to look at how do earthworms impact fuels and how does that affect how you need to run fires? How do you run a prescribed fire in an oak savanna that has no leaves? Or how do you time it so it does?
So it sounds like the earthworms move. So they're in an area,
Yeah.
they're moving. Doesn't that then allow leaves to drop into that process to kind of accumulate again? But I would imagine they move back through if there's food.
They stay.
They stay?
They stay. Earthworms have an amazing ability to go into, it's called estivus, so they'll eat until there's no more food. Some folks in Minnesota where they put out pens and they dump like 6 years worth of litter, and in a season the earthworms ate it all. They just eat, and then they stop once food's gone. And they hang out for the food to come the next time. And so, but this is a good question. What does the density of an earthworm population do after 50 years? Does it stay or does it change? And they definitely, like, if you dump a bunch of leaves in, they'll eat the sugar maple first. Actually, they'll eat the buckthorn first. They love buckthorn. Then sugar maple. Then basswood. Then oak. And then pine, really at the end. But they'll eat it all. It's just like, but they have strong preferences. Definitely strong preferences. The other thing with this, and we don't know, right? The long-term picture. So if anybody wants to go to like grad school or study earthworms or something like that, what are the long-term impacts? We don't know. It's not just fires in oak savannas though. This is a great map made available through the Driftless Area Initiative. And this is slope. So the darker green, or the brighter green, the steeper the slopes. Let's talk about erosion and sediment control, right? This is exposed dirt. This photo was taken mid-July. You get a heavy rainstorm like we had a couple days ago in Platteville. I mean, there were literally rills in this forest because it was just dirt. There's nothing holding it together. So how does this impact erosion? This is another angle we don't know. People are just starting to look at this. And it's young science, like it's really recent. It's fascinating stuff. Okay. So there's lots of questions, there's lots of directions to go, but I want to end with one story about the site up in the Chequamegon National Forest again, because I love when there's no clear answer, right? Because up until this talk, maybe you thought earthworms are great, and now you're like, oh, earthworms are bad. This is a stump. Well, I should say, the forest we were working in was maple trees, and they had come up and they were basically replacing an overstory of aspen that was probably 120 years old and was starting to die. Very common story in northern Wisconsin. Okay, this stump that is now almost entirely decayed away, if you pull it apart and you smell it, you know it's pine. This is a big pine forest that was logged off in the very first wave of logging. I mean, you've heard about the logging and the slash fires and all that, right? It is our history. It's in the driftless, it's in northern Wisconsin, it's everywhere, right? The birch tree established on the pine log, or on the pine stump, and the stump has eroded away. The birch tree got old enough, it died, it fell over. But isn't it interesting that we have this site where when we reported our results to the Forest Service, they were distraught by the potential implications of how earthworms are changing this maple community. But if you go back 200 years, it was a maple community. It was pine. And if you think about oak savannas, you go back to those maple forests that don't have maple underneath them, all those saplings are dead. What's going to come in when the overstory dies? What if making these forests drier is actually shifting them back to what they used to be? It's so easy to be attached to what is that sometimes we forget what the longer term history is. And what if instead of running prescribed fires, we just run prescribed earthworms across the site to restore? So think about that, and think about earthworms and all the things that they are doing. And then if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them at this point. So thanks very much for your attention. I really appreciate you coming out tonight.
What's the reproductive rate of earthworms?
I have no idea what the reproductive rate of an earthworm is. However, I will tell you something about earthworms. So, how many of you have ever seen the earthworms that came out when it was raining because they were drowning, and then they got stuck in the puddle and they turned all white and soggy because they were dead? That's totally wrong. Those are a certain species of earthworm that are endogeic. They only live underground. They have no pigment. They didn't come up because they're drowning. Earthworms can live months underwater as long as there's enough calcium available. They came up because that was the time to get it on. Because if you're an earthworm, you can't come out on a sunny day. So when it's raining, the reason earthworms come out is because they know they can disperse. They know they can get around. And so the way that they breed, that red band around a nightcrawler, that's very indicative of lumbricus, there's certain aspects of it, that is a clitellum, which I kind of giggle whenever I say. But that is part of the reproductive organ. Earthworms have male and female parts, and they go head to tail, and that's how they breed. Yeah, they do their business. And so they reproduce sexually as well as, the story, like there's a great Gary Larson cartoon about a worm talking to the grandchildren, and that's when your granddad came up with the axe and made all you little children. So you can also have them regenerate if they get physically separated.
If fire is really important to an oak savanna and it's destroying the leaf litter in the fire, would you see the same prevalence of worms in that habitat habitat because there's not as much food for them?
That's a great question. I don't know. What I do know is that there are some long-term studies. Oh gosh, I'm going to forget the name. There's a big prairie reserve in Kansas. It's one of the largest. Yes, thank you. It's untilled prairie, and they've been monitoring earthworm impacts. And so you have earthworms in the prairie, regardless of fire regime. I don't know how it changes their abundance. And what I don't know is if you get a whole bunch of earthworms and then you burn off all their food, if their population actually declines or if they just hang out until there is food again. I don't know how long they linger. There's a study that just came out last year where they found that if you go into a heavily infested area, especially like if you've been down to Madison, there's so much buckthorn there and the earthworms are incredibly abundant. If you remove buckthorn or honeysuckle, you actually have a decline in earthworm population. So that would suggest that their populations are linked with food source, but that's as much as I know. I don't know the answer to that.
Buckthorn or honeysuckle.
Both European species.
Are they affected by cold at all?
You can have some die-off of the worms themselves, but they're not cocoons, they're reproductive little thingies, not eggs, whatever they're called. Those can persist through extreme conditions. So typically in the coldest locations with thin soils, you'll have the adults die off every year, but then the eggs essentially hatch, and that's where your population continues.
You know, or would you expect that the negative growth effect on the maples would be similar for other species as well?
Question is, what we see in the maples, does that apply elsewhere? And this is a great question, and unfortunately it wasn't quite compelling enough for the National Science Foundation to fund me on this, because I asked them twice. But the question is, well, and I should say, my work was on maple, and if you look at the literature, almost everybody who's studied earthworm impacts have looked in maple forests. Why? Because that's where it's the most obvious, right? You want to make a dramatic story, you don't go to a place where you can't really tell that they're there. You go to where you got a 6-inch drop in the forest floor and things are all going to hell, right? The question that I propose, and there are other people looking at this now too, what about an oak forest? What about a pine forest? Do you actually see impacts in different places? And I have a project in the Boundary Waters where we're looking at kind of long-term fire history and Ojibwe influence on patterns of fire and how that story plays out. But the really convenient thing about the Boundary Waters is that it's such a controlled environment where if you want to find invasion fronts, you just go to a campsite and you just walk. And off of every single campsite that I've been to in the last couple of years and I've looked, there's this invasion front of earthworms because of bait, because somebody had worms there and pitched them, right? And in the Boundary Waters, you have pine and spruce and birch and all these different species. And so it's a great site to actually look and see, does it matter for other forests? And so if oaks aren't affected, but maples are, should the folks on the Menominee Reservation, should they be planting oaks? Should they manage for oaks instead of so there are some very practical applications of that information. And the fact is we don't know, but people are just starting to look.
So is it true that in this area, any woodland that has buttressed trees or exposed roots would be a compromised woodland?
That's a good question.
Or is that okay in some places? Would you see buttressed trunks?
Right, and so that's a really interesting question. I've talked with a lot of forest managers because if you have saturated soils, trees also tend to make buttresses. So like, especially like in a black ash swamp, a lot of the trees will have buttresses because of its environment, not necessarily because earthworms dropped to the forest floor. Or if they did, maybe it was long enough ago, we don't know.
But if it's on a slope or ridge?
There are, you might have had erosion after a fire. There are multiple factors that can kind of erode around a tree, especially if it's on a steep slope. But if you're on a pretty flat place, and if you have all these buttressed trees, the key is to look at the small trees. And if the small trees don't have buttresses, what that means is that they established on the new forest floor. Devil's Lake is a great place to see this because they've got some really big old trees that are huge buttresses, and the medium-sized trees have big buttresses, but then all the youngest trees aren't buttressed because they established after the worms went through. And so that's kind of one way to kind of control. But again, just because they're buttressed doesn't mean they're dying. You know, the soils of the driftless are so rich and they can hold water so well compared to other places that maybe it's less important here. But if you look at the patterns of tree regeneration, as far as I can tell, it's an immense impact. It really is. And I should say that's, you know, for a mature tree that's already established, yeah, it'll change how it's growing. That's fine. But if you think about, you know, maple seed is evolved to land on a layer of leaves and slowly work its roots down into that layer and eventually get to the mineral soil. If you take away the leaf litter, you take away the habitat that that species is adapted to regenerate on, and so you affect its dynamics. Oak trees are good at establishing on mineral soil, soar pine, hickory, things like that. So it's changing the system. It's kind of our opinion if it's good or bad. Depends on what we want.
So it sounds as though if a forest is a diverse forest,
Mm-hmm.
then you may have an impact, but it should be possibly slighter in visibility.
So the question of, does diversity help?
Yes.
And what was really interesting is the Menominee Forest, what we found is that they've been doing single tree selection, and it's an amazing place because if you walk around like this, it's sometimes hard to tell if it's managed or not, but then you take away your hand and there's stumps all over the place because they've gone and they've taken a tree there, they took a tree over there, and they took a tree over there. And so it was really interesting to get really ambiguous results from the ring widths. And what we don't know is, well, if you have